Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really kicking off a massive exploration. We're looking into what happens when the very way we define success in a global economy is basically called out as fundamentally broken. For centuries, economic success, well, it's meant extraction, right? Taking resources, pushing costs onto others, maximizing profit in the short term. But the material we're diving into today, it doesn't just critique that old system. It actually maps out the architecture of what might replace it. We're seeing this radical shift happening globally, moving away from that old extractive mindset. They're taking towards regenerative systems built around giving back, restoring different kinds of capital. But, the shift isn't neat and tidy. It's messy. And it's resulting in these really complex hybrid economic models popping up across industries, across nations.
That's exactly it. And our mission here is to give you that shortcut, that way to understand this new architecture that's emerging. We're diving deep into Meta-SRG 4, just and regenerative economic systems. This framework is really crucial because it pulls together the transformation across three critical areas that are all interconnected. So we're looking at, first up, SRG 15, just and regenerative economies. This is all about the structural changes, how institutions, how companies must embed equity and planetary limits, not as an option, not voluntarily, but making it mandatory. Then second, there's SRG 16. Holistic capital valuation. Now, this is the measurement revolution. It's the huge challenge of moving beyond just money, valuing things beyond the financial bottom line, and really recognizing the true worth of, say, natural capital, social capital, cultural capital. And third, we've got SRG 17, regenerative ownership and responsibility. This one explores that radical shift away from just owning things for profit towards shared stewardship.
And it looks at the legal demands for long-term accountability, making sure that those who make decisions today are actually held responsible for the consequences, maybe generations down the line.
Yeah, and what's so compelling, I think, is that these aren't just abstract ideas. They're not just theories. These are actual policy mandates, market dynamics happening right now. And often, they're driven by very pragmatic things like risk management, efficiency concerns, which, as we'll get into, is kind of a positive, if maybe accidental, driver for regeneration. We're going to unpack the mechanics behind things like, well, the fundamental difference between valuing volume versus valuing outcomes, how this idea of interspecies money could completely reimagine capital allocation, and that really radical concept of lifelong accountability for decision makers. You're going to walk away from this, hopefully, with a completely updated view of the economic rulebook that's being rewritten as we speak. Okay, let's start by unpacking SRG 15. The real complexity here, as you said, is that we're not seeing the old system just vanish overnight. Instead, these regenerative elements, they're sort of emerging within the existing, mostly extractive frameworks. And that creates these complex hybrid models.
And for these models to be more than just, superficial attempts to get beyond greenwashing or just voluntary actions, the integration of equity and planetary limits, it has to become structural, mandatory even.
Indeed. And the source material really hammers this point home. The critical shift we need is to move past voluntary corporate social responsibility, CSR. Because CSR is often optional, right? It's often underfunded, easily cut when things get tough. Real regeneration needs systemic, policy-driven integration. It needs to institutionalize these broader value systems by making them mandatory conditions for how capital gets allocated. Probably the most systematic example it's cited is China's Ecological Civilization Initiative. Now, this isn't just some moral goal they've stated, it's a structural mandate, and it's embedded deep within their financial system. Chinese banking institutions, they now have to prioritize how they allocate capital based on a set of 5 priorities. Things like technology finance, green finance, inclusive finance, pension finance, and digital finance. So what that means is, when a major bank is looking at a potential loan or an investment, the decision can't only be about the short-term monetary return anymore. It has to structurally integrate social and environmental factors aligned with those 5 priorities.
It essentially forces the core engine of the economy, the financial sector, to internalize these broader, plural values.
Okay, that structural mandate, that sounds like a really powerful constraint on just pure extraction. But how does that actually work in practice to create reciprocity?
Right.
Like if a community decides to dedicate land to conservation instead of, say, logging it, how does the system compensate them financially? And how do they do that without just turning the environment into another commodity?
Right, that's a key question. And it's handled through institutionalizing what's called ecological compensation. They use fiscal transfer systems. The policy principle behind it is pretty clear, and it's legally binding. Those who protect receive benefits. And on the flip side, the system enforces that the polluter pays, destroyer compensates.
So this mechanism, it's designed to legally and financially establish that protecting a vital ecosystem, something that provides clean water or sequesters carbon, actually generates measurable value that needs to be compensated. And this value gets transferred, usually from regions that benefit from those services, think industrial or urban areas, to the regions that are providing the services, which are often rural areas or designated ecological protection zones. It goes beyond just fines for pollution, you see. Fines often treat pollution like just another cost of doing business. This establishes more of a binding, reciprocal financial contract with the natural world. It internalizes what used to be an externalized cost or benefit. And it makes ecosystem protection an economically rational decision for the communities protecting, giving them a long-term revenue stream for that stewardship work.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to supply chains, because this feels like where, the rubber meets the road on institutionalizing interdependence. For decades, the whole economic mantra was chase the lowest cost globally, optimize for pure efficiency, which is like peak extractive logic. But our sources pointing to some major corporate players actually moving away from this purely global model. They're moving towards regionalization, prioritizing resilience instead. Take a huge global company like Coca-Cola. Their operating model is increasingly emphasizing producing and distributing locally. They're aiming to source ingredients and services within the regional markets where the product is actually sold. And the reason they give often isn't purely environmental, it's often economic. It ensures that a good chunk of the value, the jobs, the retail sales, the investment in local facilities stays within those local markets. And this creates this mutually reinforcing regional economic health. They're basically trading some global efficiency for more systemic resilience.
And this is where that critical tension comes in. What's really fascinating here is that this shift, it isn't necessarily driven by some sudden, regenerative awakening within these companies. Often it's motivated by very hard-headed, pragmatic risk management. Things like geopolitical instability, rising protectionism, tariffs, global supply chain disruptions like we saw vividly during the pandemic have just made pure globalization seem too fragile, too risky. So this broader trend towards supply chain regionalization, it's driven by that immediate need to manage risk. But the unintended positive consequence is actually pretty profound. It inadvertently builds the foundational infrastructure that's necessary for more resilient, potentially regenerative systems. When you rebuild regional manufacturing capacity, when you focus on localization, you're investing in what we might call temporal capital long-term stability, even if your immediate reason was just hedging against tariffs.
Okay, but here's the question. If those tariffs go away, or if geopolitical risks calm down, what stops companies from just immediately switching back to cheaper global sourcing? Isn't this just a temporary hedge that kind of proved the financial imperative still wins out in the end?
That's a crucial challenge, absolutely. And that's precisely why policy intervention becomes necessary if you want to lock in those regenerative gains. The sources highlight that tax policy reform is seen as really key here. Key to encouraging the redomestication, bringing supply chains back home, or at least closer to home. By using targeted tax incentives or maybe adjustments that help normalize those pricing imbalances between regions, governments can actually make the more resilient, localized approach economically competitive in the long run, even when global prices might temporarily dip lower. It provides that long-term stability signal that's needed for companies to invest in the regional infrastructure that makes localized options viable. It's about prioritizing stability over just chasing short-term cost arbitrage. Essentially, it's using regulatory power to embed temporal capital, that long-term thinking, right into financial decision-making.
Right. Now, let's talk about the just part of just and regenerative. Seems almost paradoxical, but market competition itself might be pushing companies to incorporate equity goals, especially around affordability. How does chasing market share actually align with social justice aims?
It does create a unique paradox because the vast majority of consumers, especially in emerging markets, but really everywhere, are acutely sensitive to price. Companies are realizing that if they want sustained, massive market success, they have to win on value and affordability. McDonald's, for example, explicitly attributes its market share growth to its ability to innovate and consistently deliver on value and affordability. So this competition forces them into affordability innovation, which directly addresses equity concerns, making essential or desired goods accessible.
And it's not just about making a cheaper version of something, right? It seems to be about maintaining a certain level of quality while making it accessible across the board.
Precisely. Procter & Gamble is a good example here. They emphasize that their standard of superiority has to apply across all price points, not just for their premium brands. And this means their R&D teams, their supply chain people, they're actively innovating on affordability. They're looking at everything from packaging changes, maybe moving away from large, expensive formats, to ensuring pack sizes are specifically designed to match consumer capacity in lower income markets, allowing people to buy more frequently in smaller amounts that fit their income flow. This operational commitment, making quality accessible, it acts as a really potent, inclusive strategy. It addresses equity concerns as a core part of expanding market share. It transforms accessibility from maybe a side CSR project into a central business imperative. And beyond individual companies, we're seeing institutional capacity for equity-oriented finance scaling up dramatically. The sheer scale involved shows there's political will behind it in some places. Chinese banks, for instance, expanded their inclusive finance business to over 2.65 trillion RMB in loan balances. That served over 1.72 million loan customers, mostly micro and small enterprises. This isn't some small pilot program. This is major financial infrastructure being directed towards equity objectives, deepening financial inclusion. It proves that high volume, equity-oriented finance is definitely possible when it's structurally mandated.
Okay, this leads us perfectly into what feels like a fundamental concept challenging the old economic rulebook. The sectoral pivot from focusing on volume to focusing on value or outcome. If the traditional measure of success is just output, how much stuff we produce, how many services we deliver, how does regenerative economics completely shift the focus to the outcome achieved? Let's use that really compelling healthcare analogy for the sources. Think about the classic extractive healthcare model. How does that system typically make more money? Well, it's by doing more procedures, ordering more tests, continually increasing the complexity and the price of services. It's a volume-based model. The incentive structure is inherently, perverse. It rewards increasing sickness or prolonging expensive treatments. It prioritizes the volume of transactions over actual human health.
Exactly. And the regenerative model, sometimes called value-based care, it radically flips that logic on its head. Instead of paying for the volume of services, it compensates providers for improving and sustaining patient health. The financial value isn't derived from counting how many procedures were done, but from the outcome, the patient actually staying healthy, staying out of the hospital. This represents a seismic shift in the economic logic. It prioritizes the regenerative goal, human flourishing, human health, over the extractive goal of just maximizing the number of transactions. And if we translate this logic beyond just medicine, it speaks directly to how we measure the health of the economy itself. We need to shift from things like GDP, which values all transactional activity equally, whether it's cleaning up an oil spill or treating cancer. Both boost GDP towards something like GEP, gross ecosystem product. With GEP, you're valued not for how much carbon you release or how much you deplete resources, but for how much ecological health you sustain, or even better, restore.
Okay, now let's bring technology into this, specifically AI, because it seems to present a major paradox here. AI is driving massive efficiency gains, right? It's allowing companies to manage larger scopes of work, do more with less, like reducing material inputs, optimizing logistics. That efficiency sounds inherently regenerative. It seems like it respects planetary boundaries by fighting inflationary pressure and reducing resource use per unit of output.
It does sound like that, in theory. But this is exactly where we have to confront the Jevons paradox, or what's often called the rebound effect. History shows us that efficiency gains, like, say, a more fuel-efficient engine, don't necessarily lead to less overall resource use. Often they just make the activity cheaper, and lower costs stimulate more demand, leading to a higher total volume of consumption. The more efficient engine might lead to people driving more, canceling out the gains. So in the context of AI, if efficiency gains make computation cheaper, people might simply compute more, demand more AI services. Efficiency-driven AI only supports planetary boundaries if, and this is the crucial part, if it's rigorously embedded within a fundamentally regenerative value framework. That means a framework that's already committed to maximizing positive outcomes, like health or ecological restoration, rather than maximizing volume, like transaction counts or computational cycles. If the underlying purpose of the system remains extractive, then AI just becomes a much, much more powerful and efficient tool for extraction. The structure, the goal, defines how the technology is ultimately used.
Wow. Okay, so efficiency alone clearly isn't the silver bullet. The fundamental way we measure success itself has to change.
And that necessity brings us directly to SRG 16, which is all about this measurement revolution. For an economy to be truly just, truly regenerative, it absolutely must value what's being sustained and protected, not just what's being sold and depleted.
This demands adopting what the sources call a capital ecology framework. The idea here is that genuine transformation isn't just about changing policies or structures. It requires fundamental shifts in our actual value systems. And as David Brooks apparently notes in related commentary, these values can't just be on a mission statement. They have to be embedded deep into the organization's design, right into how people are recognized, how they're rewarded, who gets hired, who gets fired. If we say we value ecological health, but we only reward quarterly financial performance, well, guess what? The ecological capital's true value will be ignored every time.
Right. But we face this massive hurdle, don't we? What the sources call a primacy problem. Economic capital money, finance has this absolutely overwhelming institutional dominance. It's got centuries of sophisticated, universally understood infrastructure backing it up. The gap accounting standards, earnings reports, GDP, global price indices. They're standardized, comparable. Natural capital, social capital, cultural capital, emotional, spiritual capital. By contrast, their measurement is still pretty nascent. They lack that comparable standardization, that universal language. And this huge imbalance, it leads to intense pressure on those non-monetary capitals. The sources call it conversion pressure. They're constantly being forced to somehow translate their inherent worth into monetary terms, into dollars and cents, just to get recognized in the boardroom, just to get considered in policy debates.
It really is the tragedy of the measurable, isn't it? Natural capital isn't valued intrinsically for its ecological function. You know, a wetland acting as a natural water filter. No, it has to be converted, reduced to a dollar value, usually under the label of ecosystem services valuation. Cultural capital isn't valued for its deep significance or the shared memory it holds. It gets framed as heritage tourism revenue. We're essentially forcing these complex, non-monetary forms of value into economic capital equivalents, just so the existing machinery of policy and finance can even see them. And this also links directly to the paradox of growth itself. Our contemporary economic systems, they seem to require continuous growth just to maintain stability, to service debt, to provide employment. This growth dependency immediately creates tension with planetary boundaries, obviously. But also, on a human level, the constant pursuit of purely extrinsic goals, you know, money, power, pleasure, fame, often overpromises happiness. It can lead to burnout, and ultimately it becomes extractive of our own internal emotional, spiritual capital. The system ends up extracting both from the planet and from our own inner reserves of meaning and purpose.
Okay, so given that huge challenge, how are institutions actively trying to formalize these other non-economic capitals? Let's start with the efforts around natural capital. How are we trying to quantify that? Well, we are seeing regions starting to establish standardized systems for natural capital accounting, or NCA. The goal here is to move beyond just tracking pollution after the fact. Regions are being pushed to assess the full value of the ecosystem services they contain using metrics like gross ecosystem product, or GEP. This means integrating environmental damage, resource consumption, and the positive ecological benefits that nature provides, things like clean air, pollination, watershed protection, right into the overall assessment of economic and social development. It's an attempt to give nature a formal balance sheet, basically, to make its contributions visible when decisions are made.
And augmenting that, you have social scientists really emphasizing the need to formalize social and emotional spiritual capitals, often by measuring subjective well-being directly. We need to supplement GDP with robust data on things like happiness, life satisfaction, levels of trust in society. And the data that's coming out is revealing some fascinating insights that really challenge our reliance on purely income-based metrics. Sure, income correlates with life satisfaction, but only up to a certain point. After that, major predictors of subjective well-being include things like having a sense of freedom, strong social connections, and the cultural context you live in. And here's a really critical data point from the studies. In some wealthy countries, happiness inequality, the gap between the happiest and least happy people, actually falls even when income inequality is rising. Now, that strongly suggests that shared public goods, things like universal access to quality education, healthcare, safe public spaces, matter more for our collective subjective well-being than just individual monetary wealth. The quality of our social capital, built through shared resources and trust, seems more vital for overall life satisfaction than just the size of our individual bank accounts.
That makes a lot of sense. And we know that investing in those public goods yields significant social returns too. Public investment in education, for example, consistently correlates with higher levels of interpersonal trust and also greater political participation. And those are essential components of a healthy democracy, a robust social capital system. They provide the political foundation that's necessary to even enact and sustain regenerative policies in the first place. Now, all of this holistic valuation, tracking multiple complex forms of capital all at the same time, it sounds incredibly difficult.
It would be practically impossible without technology, wouldn't it? How is digital infrastructure enabling this measurement revolution?
Technology is absolutely the crucial enabler here. It's what allows us to manage the sheer complexity involved. Things like agentic AI and tokenization are becoming critical infrastructure. They create secure, auditable, and programmable frameworks that can handle transactions and valuation across these different types of capital. We need systems that can ingest massive amounts of diverse data, ecological sensor readings, well-being surveys, financial reports, and harmonize them, make sense of them almost instantly. You see platforms like SAP's Business Data Cloud doing some of this heavy lifting now. They use semantic matching to harmonize a company's own data with external data sources. And this integration capability, it enables what they call a true 360 view of value. That's essential for holistic valuation. It allows you to link, for example, a company's financial performance, not just to its labor costs, but maybe to the health of the watershed it relies on, that's natural capital, and the level of trust it enjoys in the local community, that's social capital.
Okay. And this technological capability, it leads us to one of the most, frankly, mind-bending concepts in the source material: interspecies money. How do we leap from integrating social factors to actually giving economic agency to non-human species?
Interspecies money is, well, it's a profound reconceptualization of economic agency and value. And this isn't just purely theoretical, it's actually being piloted in some conservation contexts. The mechanism uses sophisticated sensors, AI, to determine the explicit real-time needs of vulnerable animal populations. For instance, monitoring the health and migration patterns of mountain gorillas. That AI-driven system then directs verifiable, often tokenized funds to nearby human workers for specific conservation tasks, like removing poacher snares found in the gorillas' territory, or replenishing water sources, or providing very localized veterinary support if needed. And this is done via a secure online platform. It's been quite aptly described as potentially becoming the gig economy for nature, where the actual health and needs of the natural world dictate the demand for human labor and direct the flow of capital.
Hold on a second. If the value, the need, is determined by the system based on the animal's needs, who programs the AI? Who sets the parameters? What stops a big centralized tech platform, maybe SAP, maybe another major cloud provider, managing all this data from basically centralizing the governance? And couldn't they then extract value from the very system that's supposed to protect nature?
That is absolutely the structural risk, a huge one. The sources imply that the governance model for something like this must be polycentric. It has to leverage local ecological knowledge alongside these global technology standards. This is crucial to prevent what we might call epistemic justice failure, basically, where the knowledge and values of the dominant tech provider just override the local inherent ecological values or the indigenous knowledge of that place. For a system like interspecies money to actually succeed in a regenerative way, the animal's needs determined by a combination of technology and local human observation must be the effective, decentralized director of the capital flows. The valuation has to remain tied to demonstrated environmental and social outcomes on the ground, not to the profit margins of some proprietary platform.
Okay, that's a critical caveat. But even with these incredible breakthroughs in measurement and potentially giving agency to nature, we still have to come back to that fundamental challenge you mentioned earlier. If we're trying to measure ecological function and cultural significance and monetary value all at the same time, how do they talk to each other? How do we make decisions when they conflict without one form of value just automatically overwhelming the others?
That really remains the single greatest obstacle, the problem of incommensurability. Our sources highlight this as the fundamental tension. These different capitals, they use incompatible units. They're non-tradable in any meaningful sense. How do you trade the monetary value of a harvested crop for the cultural significance of an ancestral burial ground located on that same land? Or for the spiritual meaning someone derives from an ancient forest? The truth is, you probably can't, not without profound loss, not without fundamentally misunderstanding what makes those non-monetary things valuable. And until we devise a way to bridge this valuation gap without just reducing everything to dollar signs of process, which inherently discounts or even destroys, the non-monetary capitals, then economic capital, the financial bottom line, will almost certainly maintain its crushing primacy in decision-making. The very act of translating deep cultural or spiritual capital into money often destroys the unique meaning that made it valuable in the first place.
Okay, let's move then to SRG 17. This deals with how we transform that core relationship between whoever holds an asset and the asset itself. We're talking about shifting from what the sources call the economics of egoism, where the main goal is individual profit, maximum extraction, towards an economics of altruism, or maybe better put, shared stewardship for the greater common good. And this shift, it seems, requires fundamental changes to our legal architecture. If you look at why the tragedy of the commons happens, it's often because property rights for natural resources are unclear, ambiguous, and the extractive model absolutely thrives in that kind of ambiguity.
That's precisely why the reform process detailed here starts with perfecting the property right system for natural resource assets. This perfection involves three key elements. First, clear ownership, knowing exactly who holds the right. Second, explicit rights and duties tied to that ownership. It's not just about what you can take, but what you're responsible for maintaining. And third, strict enforceable protection mechanisms. And crucially, the sources emphasize that the state must maintain ownership of public natural resources, like national forests or major water bodies, and ensure there's a mandated separation between the resource owners, the state, representing the public, and the regulators who oversee resource use. This helps prevent conflicts of interest and ensures independent oversight. This whole setup establishes the necessary legal framework for a robust system of compensation and accountability when environmental damage occurs. But the truly radical aspect of SRG 17, the one that really jumps out, is the introduction of this lifelong accountability system for officials who make rash decisions that result in serious environmental consequences.
Lifelong accountability. Wow. I mean, that just flies in the face of almost every short-term incentive mechanism built into modern governance, doesn't it? Whether you're talking about the 2 to 6 year election cycle for politicians or the typical corporate career path focused on quarterly results, how is this kind of radical accountability actually enforced?
It fundamentally changes the temporal scale of ownership and responsibility. Our existing systems, as you say, inherently incentivize short-term gains, often at the expense of long-term environmental health. This new system, this lifelong accountability, forces decision makers, whether they're in government or corporate leadership, to actually consider ecological timescales over immediate human gain. It forces them to prioritize what we called temporal capital earlier. The enforcement mechanisms described are multi-layered. They could involve the judicial system imposing financial clawbacks, potentially long after an official has left office, especially if the full extent of resource damage only becomes clear later. It could also involve permanent disqualification from holding future public office or potentially certain corporate board positions. This creates a powerful non-monetary penalty, a significant loss of political capital and public integrity. What it means is that a choice made today, say, approving an environmentally damaging project for short-term economic benefit could politically and financially haunt that individual decision maker for the rest of their professional life, not just until the next election cycle or performance review.
That is a serious long-term constraint on purely extractive behavior. And constraints seem key when we talk about defining non-negotiable boundaries, which is another central idea in SRG 17. We see this being institutionalized through mechanisms like ecological red lines, or ECRLs, they're sometimes called. These are just suggestions or guidelines. They are minimum spatial areas defined on maps where development is strictly controlled and often prohibited outright. The purpose isn't necessarily to stop all economic growth, but to ensure the sustained provision of absolutely vital ecosystem services, things like clean water sources, stable soil on slopes, critical habitats for pollinators, essentially preventing the permanent sacrifice of necessary ecological systems for temporary economic gain.
Yeah, the ECRL concept essentially mandates a hierarchy of value within specific geographic boundaries. It says, ecological function is non-negotiable here. This area is too important to sacrifice. This idea is perhaps reflected most clearly in the founding mandate of the U.S. National Park Service for places like Yellowstone. The mission is to preserve resources unimpaired for future generations. That foundational principle explicitly rejects selling off resources or allowing depletion within park boundaries. And you see this in practice. Take the specific challenge of external economic threats to a place like Yellowstone. The park actively manages its ecosystem integrity against proposals like geothermal energy development happening outside its borders, because that could affect the geysers inside. They've established things like water rights compacts specifically to protect the critical hydrothermal systems inside the park. They recognize that upstream or external extractive actions could instantly and permanently destroy a unique, irreplaceable natural capital asset. This policy posture dictates that the integrity of the ecosystem takes precedence over potential immediate economic opportunity nearby.
And their approach to natural processes like fire reflects that long-term temporal capital thinking too, doesn't it? When a wildfire burns in a national park, the management choice often isn't to immediately rush in, clear-cut the burned area, and replant like a commercial forest.
Exactly. Fire is increasingly recognized as a natural, even necessary process for shaping many ecosystems. So management often works to restore the natural role of fire where it's been suppressed for too long, recognizing that the short-term apparent economic loss of a burned forest actually enables vital long-term regeneration. They often leave the burned trees standing because those snags provide crucial nesting cavities for birds, habitat for insects, and slowly release nutrients back into the soil over decades. They're working with ecological cycles that operate on timescales far longer than human careers or political terms. This is a direct contrast to extractive forestry, which understandably prioritizes maximizing immediate lumber volume. Furthermore, managing this level of preservation and complex ecological care, especially across large landscapes, simply cannot be done effectively from a single central authority. It requires polycentric governance, basically, many centers of authority working collaboratively. Regenerative systems, almost by definition, demand collaborative governance structures, ones that enhance democracy and transparency through deep public participation. Look again at the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It spans multiple states, federal lands, tribal lands, private lands, and numerous jurisdictions. Managing a species like bison, which naturally migrates across all these boundaries, requires something like the Interagency Bison Management Plan. And that's a really complex negotiation process that involves federal agencies, state wildlife departments, tribal governments, local landowners, all often with very different legal mandates, cultural perspectives, and economic objectives. This ongoing negotiation reflects the inherent tension, but also the necessity of polycentric stewardship. It's messy, but it's how you ensure policies reflect a wide range of values, political, economic, cultural, not just the narrow mandate of a single federal agency.
And the financial mechanisms, they have to support this complexity too. We mentioned eco-compensation earlier, but how does it ensure fairness across all these diverse governing bodies and the rural communities involved in protection?
Right. The eco-compensation systems are designed to be the financial reinforcement for this polycentric stewardship model. The compensation funds allocated are determined specifically by ecological function zoning, not just based on population density or poverty levels alone. This design ensures that regions and, importantly, rural residents who are committed to long-term ecosystem protection receive fair transfer payments. Payments that are proportional to the ecological value they're sustaining for the wider region or nation. It's a mechanism that structurally institutionalizes that principle of reciprocity we talked about. Those who protect receive benefits. This recognition and financial reward transforms local stewardship from being just a burden or a volunteer activity into a recognized and compensated economic activity.
Okay, I want to zoom out just a little bit now as we head towards the end and touch on what feels like maybe the most vulnerable point in this entire systemic shift, the integrity gap. This gap seems to bridge the philosophical and the political foundations. Arthur Brooks, as mentioned in the related materials, apparently emphasizes that all these complex systemic efforts, the SRGs, the new metrics, the legal reforms, they'll ultimately fail if the leaders running these systems are, in his words, personally about money, power, pleasure, and fame, even while they publicly spout transcendental values like altruism and service. The stated values of the system or organization must translate into recognized, rewarded, and sometimes penalized behaviors within the structure itself. If extraction is what actually gets rewarded through bonuses, promotions, political gain, then the system will inevitably extract, regardless of what the official mission statement says.
And this philosophical integrity, or lack thereof, leads directly to the absolutely foundational role of political capital in preventing extreme extraction and ensuring basic justice. The sources cite Amartya Sen's famous observation, which has been powerfully corroborated by historical data. Major deadly famines are overwhelmingly man-made events. They are caused by political failures, not usually by absolute food shortages, and they rarely, if ever, occur in functioning multi-party democracies. The reason is quite simple, though profound. Political accountability is non-negotiable for a just system, where you have robust political capital, things like freedom of the press, fair elections, the right to dissent. Governments are forced eventually to respond to widespread human need. They can be held accountable. Without this political governance infrastructure, concentrated economic capital very quickly leads to the extractive exploitation of all the other capitals, natural, social, cultural, often resulting in catastrophic human outcomes like famine. The dramatic decline of mass life-taking famine globally over the last century is strongly attributed to the slow, uneven, but steady spread of stable democratic institutions. It underscores that political accountability isn't just nice to have for regeneration, it's an absolute prerequisite for basic human survival and justice.
And finally, that integrity gap also manifests deeply within existing ownership models that perpetuate social injustice. The sources specifically point to the gender dimension, often called the motherhood penalty. We see overwhelming evidence that women disproportionately undertake unpaid care work. This is the foundational labor that builds and sustains critical social capital, raising healthy, educated citizens, maintaining family and community ties, providing elder care, building trust. Yet this essential care work is consistently undervalued or completely unvalued, economically and politically. The failure of our current policy architecture to properly recognize, redistribute wealth for, or provide economic value for this labor demonstrates how social capital itself is often extracted disproportionately from women. It embeds systemic gender inequality right into the foundations of our society. The system takes the value of that labor for granted, maybe calls it social capital in the abstract, rather than recognizing the real economic value being produced, which would justify fair compensation or redistribution.
That's a really powerful synthesis connecting all three SRGs we've discussed. It shows that the structural reorientation of SRG 15 must be based on a truly holistic measurement system, like the one envisioned in SRG 16. And both of those rely absolutely on non-negotiable long-term accountability and ethical leadership, which is the core of SRG 17. They're all interwoven.
Before we wrap up, let's just quickly revisit that core philosophical takeaway about value itself. The idea that underpins the shift from egoism to altruism, or maybe interdependence.
Yes, the core insight, which apparently draws from thinkers like the Stoics and is highlighted in our material, is this. The true value of any benefit given or any action taken is fundamentally determined by the value placed upon it by the receiver, not by its cost of magnitude to the giver. It's a complete inversion of standard market-based economics, where price is set by production cost plus profit or supply and demand.
Which means if you take that seriously, the true value of labor isn't really the salary paid or the hours clocked. It's how much it helps others. That completely reframes the economics of work. It shifts it away from purely extrinsic self-gain, the economics of egoism, towards intrinsic service, towards complementary interdependence, perhaps the economics of altruism or mutualism.
Exactly. And that transition in mindset, that focus on mutual benefit, is what potentially facilitates positive sum outcomes. It fosters the interdependence needed to make these complex, sometimes mandatory systems of regeneration actually sustainable in the long run. We've seen today that this transformation is emerging, often through these hybrid models. We see the mandates for green finance, the regionalization of supply chains happening for risk reasons, the beginnings of radical ideas like interspecies money. These are real, measurable steps towards a potentially regenerative future, even if, as you noted, they're often motivated by pragmatic risk mitigation rather than pure altruism right now. But we absolutely must maintain a critical awareness of the fragility of this transition. We've seen how technology can enable incredible non-human valuation, but we also recognize the overwhelming institutional power of economic capital and that constant nagging problem of incommensurability. And we know that cultural capital, the collective memory, the identity, the shared spiritual narratives that guide us can be destroyed incredibly rapidly, but it takes generations, centuries even, to rebuild. So perhaps here's the final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward from this deep dive. Given the persistent, overwhelming institutional dominance of financial metrics, how can we structurally empower cultural connection, spiritual connection, those capitals that seem to guide long-term purpose and provide ethical restraint against pure extraction? How do we empower them before they get reduced entirely to just another market commodity? How do we protect the things that give us collective meaning from being measured and ultimately managed solely by the price tag we manage to put on them?
That's a profound challenge indeed, one that requires not just new metrics, perhaps, but maybe entirely new mandates and ways of valuing. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive today. We really hope this exploration has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced view of the complex road ahead for building truly just and regenerative economic systems.